A mountain man saw a family beating their pregnant child. And what he did next saved 2 lives. Out on a frozen frontier street, a rugged loner steps forward while the town just watches. One strike away from death, a young woman braces for another blow, until a stranger's hand stops the belt mid-swing. He trades silver and his own blanket to buy her freedom. But when he carries her into the mountains, the truth waiting there is far darker than anyone knows. She isn't fallen. She's a preacher's widow, cast out for love and carrying a secret the whole town tried to bury. Now, as snow traps them in his cabin and her family rides for vengeance, mercy and faith are put to the ultimate test. The mountain man who lost everything must fight not for revenge, but for redemption. When blood, birth, and forgiveness meet beneath a blizzard sky, who will be saved? And who will be changed forever? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The autumn wind whistled through Silver Bluff's wooden boardwalks, carrying the scent of pine and coming snow. Wesley McCready tightened the cinch on his packhorse, his weathered hands moving with practiced ease. The leather creaked as he secured the last of his traded goods, 20 pounds of flour, 3 pounds of coffee beans, and 2 boxes of rifle cartridges. These supplies would see him through the long winter months ahead in his mountain cabin. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings. Wesley pulled his worn slouch hat lower against the bitter wind. His shoulders, broad beneath his buckskin coat, tensed at the sound of raised voices from the direction of Thomason's mercantile. "You ungrateful, sinful girl!" A man's voice cracked like a whip. The sharp sound of flesh striking flesh split the air. Wesley's head snapped up, his gray eyes narrowing beneath thick brows. A crowd had gathered near the mercantile's wooden steps, forming a tight circle around what was happening. Through gaps between onlookers, Wesley caught glimpses of a young woman sprawled on the boardwalk. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, and blood trickled from her split lip. A man, her father by his bearing, stood over her, face purple with rage, while a woman in a faded calico dress pressed her hands to her mouth and wept. "Pa, please," the girl whispered, trying to shield herself. Her dress was plain but clean, stretched tight across her swollen belly. She couldn't have been more than 19 years old. "You've brought shame on our name, Sadie Porter," her father roared, unbuckling his belt with trembling fingers. "Your own mother can't show her face in church anymore." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but no one moved to help. Wesley saw the minister's wife turn away, clutching her shawl tight. The blacksmith studied his boots. Even the sheriff leaned against a hitching post, watching, with calculated disinterest. Wesley's jaw clenched. He'd seen this before. Good Christian folks turning their backs while cruelty wore righteousness like a mask. His hands released the packhorse's lead rope, letting it drop to the dirt. "Your brother was a man of God," Sadie's father continued, raising the doubled leather strap, "and you defiled his memory with your sin." The belt whistled through the air. Wesley moved without conscious thought, covering the distance in 4 long strides. His calloused hand caught the belt mid-swing, wrapping the leather around his fist. "Not again," he growled, his voice low and rough from disuse. The father's face reddened further. "This ain't your business, mountain man. This here's family business." Wesley didn't release his grip on the belt. "Made it my business when you struck a woman carrying a child." His words carried clearly in the sudden silence. "Ain't nothing godly about beating the helpless." "She's not worth saving," the father spat. "She's brought nothing but disgrace." Wesley reached into his coat pocket with his free hand, drawing out $2 silver. The coins caught the late afternoon light, gleaming against his dark leather glove. Without a word, he held them out to the father. The crowd's murmuring grew louder. Wesley spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of mountain winters and lonesome trails. "By the laws of God and man, I'm buying her freedom. $2, more than Judas got for betraying Christ." The father's hand shook as he snatched the coins. "Take her then. She's dead to us anyway." He turned to his wife, who couldn't meet anyone's eyes. "Come along, Martha. We're done here." Wesley shrugged off his wool blanket, traded for just that morning, and draped it gently around Sadie's shoulders. She flinched at first, then clutched the edges tight, her fingers white-knuckled against the gray wool. "Can you stand?" Wesley asked quietly. Sadie nodded, though tears streaked her dust-covered cheeks. Wesley offered his arm, helping her to her feet with careful strength. She swayed slightly, one hand pressed protectively over her rounded belly. The crowd parted like water around a stone as Wesley guided her toward his horses. Some women whispered behind their hands, while others turned their backs entirely. The sheriff finally straightened up, adjusting his gun belt. "McCready," he called out, "you sure you want to take on this kind of trouble?" Wesley didn't break stride or look back. "Reckon trouble's a matter of perspective, Sheriff. Sometimes doing right looks like trouble to those choosing wrong." He helped Sadie mount his gentle mare, adjusting the stirrups for her comfort. The girl hadn't spoken a word, but her eyes held a mix of fear and desperate hope that twisted something in Wesley's chest. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of trapped things that expected only pain from human hands. "Got a cabin up Mirror Creek way," he said, keeping his voice soft as he checked the saddle girth. "It ain't much, but there's a warm hearth and no one to judge what ain't their business to judge." Sadie's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Why would you help someone like me?" Wesley paused, looking up at her. The wind had picked up, carrying the first few snowflakes. They caught in Sadie's dark hair like stars against the gathering dusk. "Because 20 years ago, I watched good Christian folks stand by while my Jane and our baby died of fever. They said it was God's will." His voice roughened. "Reckon I've seen enough of man's cruelty wearing God's name." He gathered the horses' reins, leading them away from the mercantile's windows, where faces still pressed against the glass. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the clouds in shades of purple and gold. The storm would hit before full dark. Behind them, Silver Bluff's gossips already had their heads together, clucking like hens over this new scandal. But ahead lay the trail home, winding up into the San Juans, where only the wind and wild things would judge them. Sadie pulled Wesley's blanket closer, her shoulders straightening slightly as they left the town behind. One hand still rested on her belly, but the other had relaxed its death grip on the saddle horn. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger. "Thank you, Mr. McCready." Wesley adjusted his hat against the thickening snow. "Wesley's fine, or Bear Claw, if you prefer. That's what the Ute called me, back when I ran trap lines." A ghost of a smile touched Sadie's bruised lips. "Wesley, then. I'm Sadie Porter." She paused, then added softly, "Just Sadie now, I suppose." They continued up the trail as the first real flurries began to fall, the horses' hooves crunching against the frozen ground. Wesley led them single file where the path narrowed, his eyes automatically reading the weather in the clouds and wind. The storm would be heavy, but they'd make it to the cabin before the worst hit. Behind him, he heard Sadie humming softly, not a hymn, but a gentle lullaby. The sound floated on the wind, mixing with the distant cry of a hunting hawk and the whisper of pine boughs. Wesley felt something ease in his chest, like a fist unclenching after being held too long. Wesley led the mule away from Silver Bluff's muddy main street, trying to shield Sadie from the cold drizzle that had started to fall. Behind them, the whispers of townsfolk carried on the wind like dead leaves. Women huddled in doorways, their faces pinched with judgment. Men paused in their work to stare, some shaking their heads in disapproval. "Did you see?" one woman hissed to another. "McCready buying that fallen girl? Ain't natural. A man his age taking her up that mountain?" Wesley's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes forward. The important thing was getting Sadie to safety before the weather worsened. Already the clouds hung heavy and gray, promising worse to come. He adjusted his worn leather hat, pulling it lower against the sleet that had begun mixing with the rain. Sadie sat hunched in the saddle, his rough wool blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. Her face was pale beneath the bruising, and she hadn't spoken a word since they'd left town. One hand stayed pressed protectively over her swollen belly, while the other gripped the saddle horn, as if it were the only solid thing in her world. The first few hours passed in silence, broken only by the mule's steady hoofbeats and the increasing patter of sleet. Wesley led them higher into the foothills, following a trail that grew steeper and narrower with each mile. The mud sucked at their boots and hooves, making the going slow and treacherous. As dusk approached, Wesley began searching for shelter. He found it beneath a massive pine, its sweeping branches creating a relatively dry space beneath. The ground there was carpeted with old needles, offering some cushion from the frozen earth. "We'll stop here for the night," he said quietly, helping Sadie down from the saddle. She wavered slightly on her feet, exhausted from the day's journey. Wesley steadied her with a gentle hand, then quickly stepped back to give her space. He worked efficiently in the gathering darkness, setting up a small camp while keeping a respectful distance. First came the fire, built small and hot against the overhang where the smoke could escape through the branches. Then he spread his bedroll near the trunk for Sadie, positioning it where the heat would reach her, but far enough from the flames to be safe. From his saddlebags, Wesley pulled out a tin of coffee and some dried beef. He brewed the coffee strong and hot, pouring it into his only tin cup before offering it to Sadie, along with the best pieces of jerky. "Need to keep up your strength," he said gruffly, then retreated to the other side of the fire. He settled himself on a fallen log, deliberately turning slightly away to give her privacy while she ate. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crack and pop of the fire. Finally, Sadie's voice came, barely above a whisper. "Where are you taking me?" Wesley kept his eyes on the flames. "Got a cabin up in Mirror Creek Valley. 2 days' ride, weather permitting." Another long pause. Then, even softer. Are you going to sell me?" Wesley's head snapped up, meeting her frightened gaze across the fire. "No," he said firmly. "Ain't like that at all. Just meaning to give you safe shelter through the winter." He paused, choosing his words carefully. No strings attached, no debt to pay. Something in Sadie's shoulders eased slightly, though her hands still trembled around the tin cup. She took another small bite of jerky, chewing slowly as if to make it last. Wesley stayed where he was, keeping watch through the night as Sadie eventually curled up in the bedroll. The sleet continued to fall beyond their shelter, but the pine branches kept the worst of it off them. In the deepest part of the night, he heard her crying softly, but he didn't move. Some griefs needed privacy to be properly felt. Dawn broke gray and heavy, the clouds hanging low enough to touch the treetops. Wesley had coffee ready by the time Sadie stirred, offering her another cup before they broke camp. She accepted with a small nod, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. They rode under skies that threatened snow, the air growing colder with each mile gained in elevation. Wesley kept a steady pace, watching for signs that Sadie needed rest. Around midday, they reached a half-frozen creek where they needed to water the mule. As Wesley led the animal to drink, a harsh cough shook Sadie's frame. Without hesitation, he shrugged out of his fur coat, a precious thing made from pelts he'd trapped himself years ago, and held it out to her. "Can't have you getting sick," he said simply when she tried to protest. "Wear it." Sadie wrapped herself in the coat's warmth, burying her nose in the soft fur collar. Her next cough was less severe, and some color returned to her cheeks as they continued their journey. The afternoon wore on, each hour bringing them closer to Wesley's mountain home. The trail grew steeper, switching back and forth across the mountainside. In places, the path was barely wide enough for the mule to pass, with drops that vanished into mist on one side. Wesley led them carefully, checking each step before proceeding. As the sun began to set, a familiar smoky line appeared against the gray sky, his cabin's chimney drawing them home like a beacon. Sadie's breath caught at the sight. "I thought no one would come for me," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of all the hours she must have spent waiting for help that never came. "I thought—" Wesley kept his eyes on the trail ahead, giving her the dignity of privacy with her emotions. "Sometimes help comes from unexpected places," he said quietly. "The Good Samaritan weren't the one folks expected to stop neither." The cabin's outline grew clearer as they approached, a solid structure of squared logs with a sturdy roof and a stone chimney. Smoke curled from it in a steady stream. Someone had been keeping the fire banked while Wesley was in town. Probably Thomas Running Deer, who checked on the place when Wesley was away trading. Wesley led them across the last stretch of open ground as the first real snowflakes began to fall. The mule's breath steamed in the cold air, and Sadie had pulled the fur coat closer around herself. But ahead lay warmth and safety, and the promise of rest after a long journey. As they reached the cabin's front door, Wesley paused with his hand on the latch. "Ain't much," he said, suddenly aware of how humble his home must look to outside eyes. "But it's warm and dry, and no one up here will trouble you." Sadie's voice was soft but steady. "After today, warm and dry sounds like heaven itself." Wesley nodded and pushed open the door, leading her into the shelter of his mountain home as the storm closed in behind them. The cabin door creaked open to reveal a single room, neat but spare. Wesley quickly moved to the iron stove, where embers still glowed faintly beneath the ash. He added kindling and small logs with practiced hands, while Sadie stood just inside the doorway, swaying slightly with exhaustion. "Sit before you fall," Wesley said, nodding toward a rough-hewn chair near the stove. The furniture was simple: a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bunk against one wall, and a few shelves holding provisions. Everything spoke of utility rather than comfort. Sadie sank into the chair, still wrapped in Wesley's fur coat. Her face was flushed now, and she couldn't seem to stop shivering despite the warmth beginning to spread from the stove. Wesley noticed and frowned, pressing the back of his weathered hand to her forehead. "You're burning up," he said quietly. "The cold and wet, likely." He moved to a shelf and took down a jar of dried willow bark. "This'll help with the fever and the pain both." While water heated on the stove, Wesley efficiently made up his bunk with fresh linens. He'd kept his wife's quilts carefully stored all these years, and now he spread one across the narrow bed. The pattern of flying geese in faded blues and browns seemed to welcome Sadie to rest. "Take the bunk," he said, already unrolling his bedroll on the plank floor near the stove. "I'll sleep here." Sadie started to protest, but another wave of shivering stopped her words. Wesley pressed a tin cup of willow bark tea into her hands. "Drink this, then rest. Nothing else matters tonight." As Sadie sipped the bitter tea, her gaze wandered the cabin's interior. The firelight caught something above the stone hearth, a simple wooden cross, darkened with age. Beside it hung a woman's shawl, carefully folded, its delicate pattern speaking of gentler days. Sadie's eyes met Wesley's for a moment, questions in their depths, but he turned away to bank the fire for the night. The next 2 days passed in a haze of fever for Sadie. Wesley kept the fire steady and brought her willow bark tea and broth. He treated her bruises with cool cloths and helped her sit up to drink, but always maintained a respectful distance. When she mumbled in delirium about shame and judgment, he simply adjusted her blankets and sat nearby, whittling quietly until she settled. On the third morning, Sadie woke clear-headed for the first time. Pale winter sunlight filtered through the cabin's single window. Wesley was already up, cooking something that smelled like porridge. "Thank you," she said softly, "for caring for me." Wesley nodded without turning from the stove. "How's the fever?" "Better, I think." Sadie sat up slowly, testing her strength. Her body ached, but her head felt clearer. She looked again at the cross and shawl above the hearth, but didn't ask. Some stories needed time to be told. Later that day, when Sadie insisted on getting up, Wesley didn't argue. He watched, carefully as she took small steps around the cabin, one hand trailing along the rough wall for balance. She found a broom in the corner and began to sweep, though her movements were still weak. "Don't have to do that," Wesley said. "I want to help," Sadie replied. "I can't just lie there forever." Wesley nodded, understanding the need to feel useful. He showed her where he kept the basic provisions: cornmeal, beans, dried meat, and coffee. The organization was simple but practical, everything in its place. That evening, Sadie insisted on trying to make cornbread. Her hands shook slightly as she mixed the batter, and when she pulled the cast iron skillet from the stove, the bottom was black as coal. "I'm sorry," she said, close to tears. "I've ruined it." To her surprise, Wesley chuckled, a warm, gentle sound that seemed to surprise him as much as her. "Ain't the first burned bread I've seen," he said, already scraping the black crust into the fire. "Won't be the last, neither." Something eased in Sadie's chest at his laughter. She managed a small smile as Wesley cut into the bread's center, where some parts were still edible. They shared the salvaged pieces with beans and coffee, the meal made better by the simple acceptance of imperfection. Outside, snow fell steadily, building drifts against the cabin walls. The wind sang through the pines, a lonely sound that made the cabin's warmth feel even more precious. Wesley added wood to the stove and checked the window's shutters, ensuring all was secure for the night. "Storm's settling in," he said, returning to his chair. "Might be days before it passes." He glanced at Sadie, who had wrapped herself in the quilt by the fire. "You're safe here till the thaw." Sadie nodded, understanding all he wasn't saying. Safe from the cold, safe from judgment, safe from hands that hurt instead of helped. The cabin that had first seemed like a prison now felt like sanctuary. They sat in comfortable silence as the fire crackled and snow whispered against the walls. Wesley took out his whittling knife and a piece of pine, his hands moving steadily as shavings curled to the floor. Sadie found herself relaxing into the quiet rhythm of their shared space. Later, as Wesley spread his bedroll on the floor, Sadie spoke from the bunk. "I don't mean to take your bed forever." "Got no need to worry about that now," Wesley replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Just rest and heal. Tomorrow's soon enough for tomorrow's troubles." Sadie pulled the quilt closer, breathing in the scent of pine smoke and coffee that seemed to permeate everything in the cabin. For the first time in months, she felt her shoulders truly relax, the constant tension easing from her spine. Here, in this simple room with its wooden cross and memories of another woman's life, she had found an unexpected haven. The storm continued through the night, but inside the cabin, two souls began to trust in the possibility of safety, of acceptance, of quiet. Grace offered without demand. Wesley's gentle laughter over burned cornbread had broken something open, not a flood of words or secrets, but a small spring of hope that might, with time, grow stronger. The blizzard struck with sudden fury on their fourth day in the cabin. Wind howled through the pine branches, driving snow against the windows in angry swirls. Wesley stood at the door, watching the white curtain descend across the mountain. 3 days, maybe more, he said, closing the heavy door against the storm. Can't see the woodpile anymore. Sadie sat in her usual chair by the stove, a pile of Wesley's worn shirts in her lap. She'd discovered them that morning, stuffed in a trunk with more holes than proper stitching. Without asking permission, she'd begun to mend them. Her needle flashed in the lamplight, making neat, tiny stitches where the fabric had torn. Wesley watched her work for a moment, then settled at the table with his whittling knife and a piece of pine wood he'd been saving. The storm's voice filled their silence, whistling at the chimney, rattling the shutters, drumming endless snow against the roof. Sadie's needle kept its steady rhythm, and Wesley's knife made soft scraping sounds as he worked the wood. You don't have to fix those, Wesley said after a while, nodding at the shirts. I want to, Sadie replied softly. Seems right to repay kindness with kindness. She held up one of the shirts, showing a neat row of stitches where a sleeve had nearly parted company with the shoulder. Besides, you'd be down to bare skin by spring at this rate. A ghost of a smile touched Wesley's weathered face. His knife continued its careful work, shaping the wood with patient strokes. Curls of pine fell to the floor as the form of a spoon began to emerge. Hours passed. The storm showed no sign of weakening. Wesley made coffee and heated beans for their dinner, while Sadie finished mending a third shirt. As they ate, her eyes kept straying to the wooden cross above the hearth and to the carefully folded shawl beside it. Finally, she gathered her courage. Why do you live alone up here? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Wesley's hands stilled on his whittling. For a long moment, only the storm spoke. Then he set down his knife and looked at the cross. Lost my Sarah 15 years ago, he said. His voice was rough but steady. And our little girl, Mary. Fever took them both in 1 week. He touched the shawl gently as he passed it. Couldn't bear to stay in town after. Too many babies crying. Too many women wearing shawls like Sarah's. So I came up here where the only crying is the wind. Sadie's hands tightened on her mending. I'm so sorry, she said. Wesley nodded, accepting her words. Then he turned to her, his eyes kind but direct. Your turn now. Your folks called your marriage a sin. Why? Sadie set down her sewing. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellow with age and worn at the creases. She handled it like something precious. Because they didn't choose him, she said. She carefully unfolded the paper, a single page torn from a Bible. Because Elias was only a circuit preacher's son, not the banker's boy they wanted for me. Her finger traced the signatures at the bottom of the page. But we were properly married, before God and witnesses. Wesley took the page with careful hands. There were 2 signatures, written in firm, clear strokes. Elias Porter and Sadie Mitchell Porter. The date was from 8 months ago. Elias Porter, Wesley read slowly. The late Reverend Porter's boy? Sadie nodded, tears filling her eyes. He died in the early snow 2 months ago. There was a lost child, and Elias... Her voice broke. He found the boy, got him home safe. But the cold was too deep in his chest. He never recovered. Wesley stared at the marriage record, understanding dawning in his eyes. This wasn't some ruined girl he'd rescued from a beating. This was a preacher's widow, cast out by her own family for daring to choose love over obedience. The wind screamed around the cabin corners. Snow lashed the windows like tiny whips. Inside, the silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of false judgment and unearned shame. Wesley carefully refolded the Bible page and handed it back to Sadie. "A preacher's child won't freeze on my watch," he said quietly. His voice held steel beneath the gentleness. Sadie clutched the paper to her chest, tears sliding down her cheeks. "They said I shamed them," she whispered. "That I deserved." Her hand touched her healing split lip. "No," Wesley said firmly. "No child deserves a beating for loving true." He picked up his whittling knife again, turning the half-formed spoon in his hands. "Your man saved a life, gave his own doing it. There's no shame in that love, girl. Only honor." Fresh tears spilled from Sadie's eyes. She wiped them away with her sleeve, then picked up another of Wesley's shirts to mend. Her stitches were slower now, but each one seemed to carry a prayer. Wesley returned to his whittling, shaping the spoon's bowl with careful strokes. The wood was good pine, straight-grained and sweet-smelling. He worked slowly, letting each cut reveal the form hiding inside. The storm raged on as afternoon faded to evening. Wesley built up the fire and lit the lamp, its warm glow pushing back the gathering shadows. Sadie finished the last shirt and folded them neatly, the pile a testament to hours of patient work. "Thank you," Wesley said, nodding at the mended clothes. Sarah always said a man couldn't survive long without someone to mend for him. He held up the finished spoon, studying it in the lamplight. The wood gleamed golden, smooth as silk, its curves graceful and true. "This is for you," he said, holding it out. "Every woman needs her own spoon." Sadie took it with wondering hands. The bowl was perfectly shaped for sipping soup, the handle just long enough to reach the bottom of a cooking pot. She ran her finger along its satiny surface, feeling the care worked into every curve. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Wesley shrugged, but pleasure showed in his eyes. "Needed something to do while you fixed my shirts." He stood and checked the stove, adding another log. "Storm's got us trapped for a spell. Might as well make ourselves useful." Sadie nodded, still cradling the spoon. In just 3 days, this cabin had become more of a home than her father's house had been in months. Here, there were no harsh words, no raised hands, no judgment for loving a good man who died too soon. Wesley settled back in his chair and chose another piece of wood from his pile. His knife began its patient work again as the storm sang its wild song outside. Sadie watched him for a moment, then reached for her needle and thread. There was a hole in her own shawl that needed mending. They worked in comfortable silence as night deepened around the cabin. The lamp burned steady, the fire crackled warm, and 2 lonely souls found peace in simple tasks and quiet understanding. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the mountain, but inside, healing had begun, as gentle and gradual as the shaping of wood beneath a careful blade. Days flowed like the snow outside, one into another. The cabin's small world settled into gentle rhythms as December deepened. Wesley showed Sadie how to bank the fire at night, teaching her the careful art of preserving coals until morning. "Too many ashes smothers them," he explained, demonstrating how to scrape them just so. "Too few, and they'll die before dawn." His weathered hands guided hers through the motions until she got it right. Sadie proved a quick study. Soon she could wake the sleeping embers and build them into dancing flames that warmed the cabin's single room. The pride in her eyes when she succeeded made Wesley's heart ache with memories of teaching his Sarah these same skills years ago. Mornings found them sharing coffee and cornmeal mush, which Sadie learned to cook without scorching. She discovered that stirring constantly was the secret, and that a pinch of salt made all the difference. Wesley watched her practice, noting how she hummed hymns while she worked, soft, sweet tunes that filled the cabin's quiet corners. "You've got a good touch with the cooking," he said one morning, scraping his bowl clean. "Better than my burnt offerings, that's certain." Sadie smiled, pleased. "Mama always said any fool can cook if they pay attention." Her face fell slightly at the mention of her mother, but she squared her shoulders and carried on. After breakfast came caring for Daisy, the sturdy mule who'd carried Sadie to safety. Wesley showed her how to break the ice in the water trough and measure out feed, explaining that mules needed extra care in winter. "Daisy's earned her keep twice over," he said, patting the mule's neck. "Brought you here through that storm without a misstep." Sadie stroked Daisy's soft nose. "She's gentle for a mule. Most I've known were ornery things." "Like most creatures," Wesley replied. "They show kindness when they're treated kind." The days fell into pattern. Wesley checked his trap lines, bringing home snowshoe rabbits with their winter white fur. He taught Sadie to scrape the delicate hides, showing her how to stretch them on small frames he'd carved. "Steady pressure," he instructed, guiding her hands. "Let the blade do the work." The scraping motion was repetitive, but needed a gentle touch. Sadie's first attempts were rough, but she improved with practice. When her back ached from the work, Wesley fashioned her a chair with extra cushions, positioning it where she could still help while resting. He noticed how she cradled her growing belly, now visible even through her loose dress. The nights grew longer as winter deepened. After supper, they'd sit by the fire while Sadie read from her small Bible. The book was well worn, its pages soft from years of turning. She favored the Psalms, finding comfort in their ancient words of hope and deliverance. "The Lord is my shepherd," she read one evening, her voice soft in the firelight. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Wesley listened, whittling by the fire. Though his own faith had grown rusty with disuse, something in him stirred at the familiar words. He remembered Sarah reading these same passages, remembered the peace they'd brought her. The pregnancy advanced, changing Sadie's shape week by week. Wesley found himself growing more protective, checking the cabin roof for leaks and stockpiling water in every spare container. He cleared paths through the deep snow, to the mule barn, to the outhouse, to the woodpile, marking them with poles so they'd be visible even in darkness. When wolves howled in the night, their eerie songs echoing off the mountainsides, Wesley sat awake by the door. His rifle rested across his knees, loaded but safe. He told himself he was just being cautious, but truth was, he couldn't bear the thought of harm coming to Sadie or her unborn child. One quiet evening, as they sat by the fire, Sadie suddenly gasped. Her hand flew to her belly, eyes wide with wonder. "What is it?" Wesley asked, alarmed. "Are you poorly?" "No," she whispered. "The baby, I felt it move. Really move, for the first time." She looked up at him, joy lighting her face. "Would you like to feel?" Wesley hesitated, suddenly unsure. But Sadie reached for his rough hand, and placed it gently on the curve of her belly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he felt it, a definite push against his palm, like a tiny fist saying hello. "Feels like hope," Sadie whispered, her eyes bright with tears. Wesley's throat tightened. "Haven't felt that in a spell," he answered softly, his voice rough with emotion. They sat there in the firelight, both marveling at the miracle of new life stirring beneath their joined hands. The wolves sang their wild songs outside, but in the cabin, peace reigned. Wesley realized that somewhere in these quiet days of shared work and gentle companionship, his heart had begun to thaw like spring ice breaking up on the river. Sadie's presence had changed the cabin. Where once there had been only silence and memories, now there was quiet humming, the scratch of needle on cloth, the smell of cooking. Her growing belly promised new life where death had long held sway. Even his old grief felt different, less like a weight and more like a story he could finally share. The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing on the walls. Wesley withdrew his hand reluctantly and added another log to the flames. Tomorrow would bring its own work and worries, but tonight, hope had visited their mountain sanctuary. Like the coals they banked each evening, it glowed warm and steady, promising light would return with the dawn. Sadie returned to her mending, but her free hand often strayed to her belly, touching the spot where new life had made itself known. Wesley watched her from his chair, his heart full of emotions he couldn't name. The cabin felt different now, no longer a place of exile, but a shelter for healing hearts and new beginnings. Outside, snow continued to fall, adding another layer to the deep drifts that isolated them from the world below. But inside, two lonely souls had found unexpected comfort in shared days and quiet understanding. The mountain winter that had threatened to trap them had instead given them time to heal, to hope, and to rediscover faith in life's endless capacity for renewal. The days grew shorter as December settled over the mountain. Wesley found himself watching Sadie's careful movements around the cabin, noting how she cradled her growing belly while tending the fire or stirring their morning porridge. Something stirred in his heart, a feeling he hadn't expected to find again. One morning, while Sadie was busy with her mending, Wesley dragged 2 dried aspen logs into the cabin. He positioned them near his workbench, running his hand over the pale, smooth bark. "What are you planning to make?" Sadie asked, looking up from her needlework. Wesley measured the logs with his hands, seeing the cradle already taking shape in his mind. "Thought the little one might need a proper place to sleep come spring." Sadie's eyes brightened with understanding. "A cradle?" He nodded, already reaching for his tools. "Aspen's good wood for it. Light but strong. Won't splinter neither once it's worked proper." Over the next few weeks, Wesley worked on the cradle whenever daylight allowed. His hands, usually so sure with an axe or trap, moved with extra care as he shaped the rockers. He remembered making one like it years ago, for his Sarah, though he kept that thought to himself. Sadie watched him work while she pieced together a small blanket from the good parts of his worn-out shirts. She'd insisted on making something useful from them instead of burning them for rags. The familiar blue and brown fabric took on new life under her clever fingers. "Waste not, want not," she said, holding up her work to check the stitching. "Though I reckon this little one won't care much about matching patterns." Wesley smiled at that, then turned his attention back to the cradle. He'd begun carving verses into the headboard, ones that came back to him from years of hearing Sarah read the good book. The letters were simple but clear. "The Lord is my shepherd" on one panel, "Be not afraid" on another. His concentration was so focused that he didn't notice the knife slipping until blood welled up from his thumb. "Dad burn it," he muttered, more annoyed than hurt. Sadie was beside him in an instant, taking his hand in hers. "Let me see that." She examined the cut with gentle fingers. "You're lucky. It's not too deep. Though I must say, for such a capable man, you're looking all thumbs today." Wesley couldn't help but chuckle at her teasing tone. "Reckon you're right about that." She cleaned the cut with water and wrapped it carefully in a strip of clean cloth. "There now. Though maybe you should rest those hands a spell." The cabin filled with their shared laughter, a sound that seemed to chase away the winter shadows. Wesley noticed how the lamplight caught the gold in Sadie's hair, how her eyes crinkled when she smiled. It reminded him that joy could sneak up on a person even when they weren't looking for it. As Christmas Eve approached, the cradle took its final shape. Wesley worked late into the evenings, polishing the wood until it gleamed in the lamplight. Outside, snow fell in lazy spirals, coating the world in diamond dust. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth and purpose. Sadie finished her blanket on Christmas Eve morning, carefully washing and pressing it before folding it away. She'd added her own touch, a small cross stitched in the corner with careful, tiny stitches. That evening, after their simple supper, Wesley cleared his throat. "Got something for you," he said, pulling the cradle out from behind his workbench where he'd hidden it under a cloth. Sadie's hands flew to her mouth as he unveiled it. The cradle stood proud on its curved rockers, every surface smooth as silk. The scripture verses caught the lamplight, each letter carved with care and love. "Oh, Wesley," she whispered, running her fingers over the words. "It's beautiful." Tears sparkled in her eyes as she read each verse aloud. "Your turn," she said after a moment, reaching for a folded piece of paper she'd kept hidden in her Bible. "It's not much, but—" Wesley opened it carefully. In her neat handwriting was a single verse. "Come now, and let us reason together, saith the Lord. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool." Isaiah chapter 1, verse 18. He stared at the words, feeling them sink deep into his heart. How long had it been since he'd allowed himself to believe in such promise of renewal? "Would you pray with me?" Sadie asked softly. "I know you haven't much lately, but—" Wesley nodded, unable to speak. They bowed their heads together, and Sadie's clear voice filled the cabin with simple words of gratitude. For safety, for shelter, for new beginnings. Wesley found himself adding his own quiet "Amen" at the end. That night, as snow fell silent outside their window, Wesley dreamed of Sarah. But for the first time in 15 years, she wasn't lying pale and still. Instead, she stood in a sunlit meadow, smiling at him with that gentle look he remembered so well. In the dream, she nodded once, as if giving her blessing, before fading into the light. Wesley woke to find his cheeks wet with tears, but they weren't the bitter tears of grief he'd known for so long. Something had shifted in his heart, like spring ice breaking up on the river. The cabin wasn't just a shelter anymore. It had become a home again, filled with the promise of new life and renewed faith. He lay there in the pre-dawn darkness, listening to Sadie's soft breathing from her bed across the room, and the tiny sounds of the mountain night. The cradle stood between them, its presence a bridge between past and future, loss and hope. Wesley touched the verse Sadie had given him, tucked safely under his pillow, and offered up his own silent prayer of thanks. The mountain held its breath as winter began to loosen its grip. Early March brought warmer days that turned the crusty snow into patches of soft white between exposed rock and pine needles. Wesley noticed how Sadie had grown more confident moving around the cabin and the nearby clearing, her steps sure despite her advancing pregnancy. One crisp morning, Wesley pulled his old squirrel gun from its rack above the door. The worn stock still bore the smooth patina of years of careful handling. He checked the action, working it back and forth until satisfied. "Time you learned to handle this," he said, holding the rifle out to Sadie. "Might need it if I'm gone checking traps." Sadie looked up from her mending, eyes wide. "I've never shot before." "No better time to learn." Wesley's voice was gentle but firm. "Can't leave you up here without knowing you can protect yourself." They went outside, where Wesley had set up tin cans on a fallen log. The morning air bit their cheeks as he showed her how to hold the rifle, his rough hands adjusting her grip on the smooth wood. "Keep both eyes open," he instructed. "Breathe easy like you're reading your Bible. When you're ready, squeeze slow. Don't pull." Sadie's first shot went wide, startling a pair of magpies into flight, but her second caught the edge of a can, sending it spinning. By her fifth try, she was hitting more than missing. "You're a natural," Wesley said, watching her reload with steady hands. Though pride in his voice made her cheeks flush deeper than the cold had managed. Sadie laughed, the sound bright against the mountain silence. "Never thought I'd take to shooting," she admitted, lowering the rifle to rest. "My mother would surely faint dead away." Wesley noticed how the mention of her mother brought a shadow to her eyes, but it passed quickly as she raised the rifle again. The next shot rang true. Dead center. Later that morning, they made their way downhill to check Wesley's trap line. The path was treacherous with melting snow, but Sadie managed well, one hand on her belly, the other gripping a walking stick Wesley had carved for her. They could hear the creek before they saw it, its voice grown loud with meltwater. "Watch your step here," Wesley cautioned, as they approached the swollen stream. What had been a quiet trickle in winter now rushed brown and fast between its banks. "Spring flood's coming early this year." They checked the traps together, finding 2 rabbits and a fox. Wesley showed Sadie how to reset each one, explaining the signs that told where animals would pass. She listened intently, asking questions that showed she was learning to read the mountain's ways. It wasn't until they were heading back that Wesley noticed the tracks, horse prints in a patch of soft snow, not more than a day old. A single rider had passed within a mile of his cabin, which was strange. No one had business this high up until summer hunting season. Wesley said nothing, but his eyes scanned the trees more carefully on their return journey. He guided Sadie along a different path than their outbound route, one that kept to harder ground where they'd leave no trail. That evening, as Sadie prepared their supper, Wesley took down his long rifle. The familiar routine of cleaning and oiling it brought some comfort, but his hands moved with extra care, making sure every part was ready. The metal gleamed in the lamplight as he worked. Sadie watched him from the corner of her eye as she stirred the beans. She didn't ask about his sudden attention to the weapon, but Wesley could sense her unease in the way she moved around the cabin, checking the door latch more than usual. After their meal, Wesley knelt by his bed, head bowed in prayer. He hadn't been much for praying since Sarah died, but tonight the words came easy. "Lord, keep us safe. Show me the way to protect what you've given into my care." Morning brought a sharp frost and something else. A telegram slipped under the cabin door sometime before dawn. Wesley found it when he went to fetch wood for the morning fire. The paper was crisp, official-looking, its message brief but clear. "Family from Silver Bluff searching for missing daughter. Any information welcome." Wesley's jaw tightened as he read the words. Without comment, he crossed to the stove and opened its iron door. The telegram caught quickly, curling into ash that floated up the chimney. Only then did he glance at Sadie, who stood in her nightdress by her bed, one hand pressed against her belly. Their eyes met across the cabin. Neither spoke of the telegram, but Wesley noticed how Sadie's hands trembled slightly as she helped him prepare breakfast. The morning coffee tasted bitter in his mouth as he considered what might be coming. Outside, the mountain stood peaceful in the early light, giving no sign of the trouble the telegram promised. But Wesley knew better than most. Spring storms could gather fast in these hills, turning fair sky to fury in the space of an hour. He'd weathered many such storms in his years alone on the mountain. Now, watching Sadie move carefully around their shared home, he knew with certainty that he'd weather whatever came next. The Lord had sent her to his door for a reason, and he aimed to honor that trust. Wesley added extra wood to the stockpile by the door that day, checked and rechecked his rifles, and made sure the cabin's heavy shutters would close tight. Each task was done quietly, methodically, like a man preparing for a long siege. Sadie matched his silence with her own, but her prayers that night were longer than usual, whispered into the darkness after she thought Wesley had fallen asleep. He lay awake long after her breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep, listening to the night sounds of the mountain and remembering the tracks in the snow. Tomorrow would bring what it brought, but tonight his rifle stood ready by the door, and Sadie slept safe under his roof. For now, that would have to be enough. The fire burned low in the stove, casting soft shadows on the cradle that stood ready between their beds. Wesley touched the smooth wood as he passed, feeling the scripture verses he'd carved there. "Be not afraid," his fingers traced the words, and he held on to them like a promise in the dark. The morning sun cast long shadows across the clearing as Wesley worked at his chopping block. His axe rose and fell in a steady rhythm, splitting pine logs for the evening fire. Despite the warming weather, nights still held winter's bite this high in the mountains. Sadie stood at the cabin's single window, watching him work while she kneaded dough for the day's bread. Her fingers moved with practiced ease now, so different from her first clumsy attempts months ago. The familiar task let her mind wander, remembering how far she'd come since that terrible day in Silver Bluff. A movement on the lower ridge caught her eye. Her hands stilled in the dough as 3 riders emerged from the tree line. Even at this distance, she recognized the rigid set of her father's shoulders, the way he sat his horse like he was riding to Sunday service. 2 strange men flanked him, rifles clearly visible across their saddles. The bowl clattered against the table as Sadie stumbled back. "Wesley!" Her voice cracked with fear. "Riders coming, it's my father!" Wesley's axe buried itself in the chopping block as he straightened, eyes scanning the ridge. Without a word, he strode to the cabin, his expression grim. "Stay inside," he said firmly, closing the door behind her. "No matter what you hear." "But..." Sadie's protest died as Wesley shook his head. "Trust me," he said softly. Then he walked back out, leaving his rifle hanging above the door. The riders approached at a steady pace, spreading out slightly as they neared the cabin. Sadie's father sat straight-backed on his bay horse, his face hard as the mountain granite. The men with him looked rough. Trail riders or maybe mine guards, their eyes cold beneath their hat brims. "McCready!" her father shouted. "Send out my daughter!" Wesley stood his ground, hands loose at his sides. "She ain't yours to claim anymore, Mr. Porter. She's a grown woman, married proper before God." "Married?" Her father spat into the dirt. "To a dead boy who sweet-talked her with lies? That paper she waves around ain't worth the ink it's printed with." "The word says different," Wesley replied calmly, "and I reckon God's law stands higher than your opinion on the matter." One of the riders shifted his rifle, letting sunlight glint off the barrel. "Ain't just his opinion you're dealing with now, old man. Girl comes with us, one way or another." Inside the cabin, Sadie pressed her hands against her mouth, stifling a sob. Through the window she could see Wesley standing alone against the 3 mounted men, his gray hair catching the morning light. He looked so vulnerable without his rifle, yet his voice carried clear and steady across the yard. "You're trespassing on my land," Wesley said. "I bought that girl's freedom fair in Silver Bluff, witnessed by half the town. She's under my protection now, and she'll stay that way." Protection? Her father's laugh held no humor. "Is that what you call corrupting a young girl? Taking advantage of her situation?" He leaned forward in his saddle. "The whole territory knows what mountain men like you do with women you protect." Wesley didn't move, but his voice turned hard as iron. "You'd best watch your tongue, Porter. I've lived clean before God 40 years on this mountain. Can't say the same for a man who'd beat his own daughter in the street." The second rider brought his rifle up to rest across his pommel. "Awful brave talk for an unarmed man." "I'm giving you fair warning," Wesley replied. "Leave now, ride back down that mountain before dark. What happens if you stay won't be on my conscience." Sadie's father yanked his horse's head around. "We'll be back at dawn," he snarled. "With more men. Have her ready to travel, or there'll be trouble you won't survive." He kicked his horse forward, the other riders falling in behind him as they headed back toward the tree line. Wesley watched until they disappeared from view. Only then did his shoulders sag slightly as he turned back to the cabin. Inside, he found Sadie crumpled by the window, tears streaming down her face. "They'll take me away," she whispered. "They'll take my baby. Oh, God. Wesley, what are we going to do?" Wesley knelt beside her, his weathered hands gentle on her shoulders. "Look at me, girl." He waited until she raised her eyes to his. "Not while I breathe. You hear me? Not while I breathe will they lay a hand on you or that child." "But there'll be more of them tomorrow," Sadie said, her voice shaking. "And you can't. I won't let you die for me." Wesley helped her to her feet, leading her to sit at the table. "Hush now," he said, pouring her a cup of water. "The Lord didn't bring you to my door just to abandon you to wolves. We've got work to do before night falls." He moved around the cabin with purpose, checking the water barrel, gathering supplies. "First thing," he said, "you need to eat something. That baby needs strength, and so do you." He stirred up the fire in the stove and set a pot of beans to warm. Sadie watched him, her tears slowly subsiding. "What are you planning?" Wesley paused in his work, looking at her steadily. "There's caves up higher where I used to shelter in bad weather when I was trapping. Good hiding spots, if you know where to look. And I reckon your father and his friends don't know these mountains like I do." "You want us to hide in caves?" Sadie's hand went to her swollen belly. "Just long enough for them to give up and ride away," Wesley assured her. "I've got supplies cached up there from my trapping days. We'll manage fine." He returned to his preparations, speaking as he worked. "The important thing is getting you somewhere safe before dawn. They'll be watching the main trail, but I know another way up." Sadie stood, squaring her shoulders. "What can I do to help?" Wesley's eyes softened at her courage. "Pack what food you can carry easily. Your Bible, too. We might need those words of comfort." He crossed to the door and took down his rifle, checking it with practiced hands. "I'll get the mule ready and move the rest of our supplies to the cave before dark." As the afternoon wore on, they worked steadily. Wesley made several trips up the mountain, leading Daisy the mule laden with supplies. Sadie packed carefully, wrapping bread and dried meat in cloths, gathering the herbs she'd dried for tea. Her hands shook sometimes, but she kept working. When dusk began to settle over the mountain, Wesley returned from his last trip. He found Sadie sitting by the fire, one hand resting on her belly, the other holding her small Bible. Her face in the firelight looked young and frightened, but determined. "The cave's ready," Wesley said quietly. "We'll leave before moonrise. Try to rest a bit now." Sadie nodded, but her eyes went to the window. "Wesley," she whispered, "thank you for everything, for being the answer to prayers I was too afraid to speak." Wesley turned away, busying himself checking his rifle one last time. "Just doing what's right," he said gruffly. "The Lord knows I failed to protect my own family once. Won't fail again." They sat in companionable silence as darkness crept over the mountain. Through the window they could see the first stars appearing, bright and cold in the spring sky. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely sound that made Sadie shiver despite the fire's warmth. Wesley rose and added another log to the stove. "Get some sleep if you can," he said. "We've got a hard climb ahead, but I promise you this, they won't take you. Not while I draw breath." Sadie looked up at him, this weathered mountain man who had become more father to her than her own flesh and blood. "I believe you," she said simply. "God sent me to your door that day. He won't forsake us now." Wesley nodded, moving to take up his watch by the window. Outside, the mountain stood silent under the rising stars, giving no sign of the confrontation to come. But Wesley's eyes never stopped scanning the darkness, his rifle ready across his knees as he prepared to defend the family God had unexpectedly given back to him. Night fell like a heavy blanket over Pine Hollow Ridge. Wesley moved through the cabin with practiced quiet, checking the windows one final time before sliding the heavy wooden bar across the door. The iron sight of his rifle gleamed dully in the lamplight as he loaded it with careful precision, each bullet a solemn promise of protection. Sadie sat rigid in the rocking chair by the stove, her hands gripping the wooden arms so tight her knuckles showed white. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps that made Wesley look up sharply from his task. "You all right, girl?" he asked, setting the rifle aside and crossing to her. She shook her head, face contorted. Pain, like knives. Her hands moved to cradle her swollen belly. "The baby. It's too soon." Wesley's weathered face creased with concern as he knelt beside her. "Easy now. Could be just fear working on you." He covered her trembling hand with his own. "Try to breathe steady, like when we're reading scripture. Remember how?" Sadie nodded, struggling to match his slow, deliberate breaths. "In through the nose," she whispered. "That's right. Out through the mouth, nice and easy." Wesley kept his voice low and calm, though his eyes never stopped scanning the darkness beyond the windows. Like the wind in the pines. That's the way. The cabin creaked and settled around them as the temperature dropped. Wesley had just risen to stoke the fire when a sound split the night. The sharp crack of a rifle shot, followed by splintering wood as a bullet struck the doorframe. Sadie jerked in her chair with a cry of fear. Wesley moved like a shadow, extinguishing the lamp with one swift motion before taking up his position by the window. "Porter," a voice shouted from the darkness, "this is your last chance to send her out peaceful-like." Wesley's reply was measured but carried clearly through the night air. "I want no blood spilled on this mountain, but I'll defend what's mine. Back away now." Another shot rang out, closer this time. Wesley's rifle answered, the fourth muzzle flash briefly illuminating his stern face as he fired high over the attackers' heads. The sound echoed off the ridgeline like thunder. "That's my marking shot," Wesley called out. "Next one won't be so neighborly." In her chair, Sadie fought another wave of pain, biting her lip to keep quiet. Wesley glanced back at her, his face softening with worry before hardening again as he returned to his vigil. The night dragged on, marked by occasional shots and shouted threats from the darkness. Wesley moved between windows, conserving ammunition, firing only when the men grew too bold in their approach. The hours crept by like molasses in winter. Sadie's labor pains came and went in waves, each one drawing a soft whimper she tried to suppress. Wesley brought her water between exchanges of fire, wiping her brow with a cool cloth and murmuring encouragement. "Just hold on," he whispered. "Dawn's coming. They can't keep this up forever." Around midnight, the attackers tried circling behind the cabin. Wesley met them with 2 quick shots that sent them scrambling back into the trees. "Got plenty more where that came from," he shouted. "And better aim in daylight." The long hours wore on. Sadie dozed fitfully between pains, her hands locked white-knuckled on the chair arms. Wesley never left his post, though fatigue pulled at his shoulders and his eyes burned from straining against the dark. Finally, false dawn began to pale the eastern sky. The shooting had stopped an hour earlier, and now voices carried clearly through the thin mountain air. "This ain't finished, Porter!" It was Sadie's father, his voice hoarse with rage and exhaustion. "We're riding for the sheriff. He'll sort this out proper." The sound of horses moving through brush followed, growing fainter as the riders withdrew down the mountain. Wesley waited until he could no longer hear them before lowering his rifle with a heavy sigh. He turned to find Sadie slumped in her chair, tears tracking silently down her pale face. Her wrists were raw and bleeding where she'd gripped the wooden arms through each contraction. "Let me see to those," Wesley said gently, retrieving his medical kit. He cleaned and bandaged her wrists with tender care, his big hands surprisingly delicate with the task. "They'll be back," Sadie whispered, "with the law this time." Wesley nodded, finishing the bandage. "Reckon so, but we'll face them in daylight, with truth and right on our side." He helped her sit more comfortably, checking her pulse with practiced fingers. "How are the pains now?" "Easing some." She managed a weak smile. "Maybe the baby knows to wait for a quieter time." "Smart child," Wesley said, his weathered face creasing in a brief smile. He moved to the stove, stirring the banked coals and setting coffee to brew. The familiar domestic motions seemed to help calm them both after the long night's tension. As the sun rose fully over the mountain, its golden light crept across the cabin floor, touching Sadie's face with warmth. She had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep in the rocking chair, one hand resting protectively over her belly. Wesley stood at the window, rifle ready but held loose in his hands, watching the morning mist rise from the valley below. His eyes were tired but alert, scanning the trail that led down to Silver Bluff. He knew the sheriff would come, likely by mid-morning if they rode straight through. What happened then would depend on law and truth, and perhaps on mercy. But for now, in this quiet moment between night and day, he stood guard over the small family God had given back to him, ready to face whatever the light might bring. The morning sun crept over Pine Hollow Ridge, painting the snow-patched ground in strips of pale gold. Wesley stood at the cabin window, his wounded shoulder throbbing where he'd bound it with a strip of cloth. The night's vigil had left him bone-weary, but his eyes remained sharp as he watched the trail below. Sadie dozed fitfully in the rocking chair, her face drawn with exhaustion. The early labor pains had eased somewhat, but Wesley could see how she cradled her belly, protective and afraid. The crunch of hooves on frozen ground made him straighten. "They're back," he said quietly. Sadie's eyes flew open, fear flooding her face. Wesley moved to check his rifle one final time, his movements precise despite his fatigue. Through the window, he counted 5 riders approaching, Sadie's father, the 2 men from before, and 2 others he didn't recognize. The morning light gleamed dully off gunmetal at their hips. But what made his blood run cold was the coil of rope hanging from her father's saddle horn. Stay inside, Wesley told Sadie firmly. Whatever happens. He stepped out onto the cabin's small porch, rifle held low but ready. The cold air bit at his face as he watched the riders approach. They stopped about 30 yards out, spreading into a loose half-circle. Sadie's father urged his horse forward a few steps. His face was hard as granite in the morning light. He grabbed the rope from his saddle, letting it uncoil toward the ground. "I've come to take what's mine," he called out, voice rough with rage. "She'll go home, righteous or dead. Makes no difference now." Wesley's grip tightened on his rifle. "She's not property to be claimed," he answered steadily. "She's a married woman carrying an innocent child." "Married?" The father spat in the dirt. "To a dead boy with a forged paper? That ain't marriage in God's eyes." "God sees more than you reckon," Wesley said. "He sees a father ready to murder his own blood." One of the riders, a lean man with a scarred face, raised his pistol. "Enough talk. Step aside, old man." Wesley didn't move. "You'll have to kill me first." The shot cracked across the mountain slope. White-hot pain blazed across Wesley's left shoulder as the bullet tore through flesh. He staggered but kept his feet, blood darkening his shirt sleeve. Behind him, Sadie's scream split the air. Pain and fear tangled together. Wesley's rifle came up smooth as breathing. His single shot struck true, sending the shooter's pistol spinning from a ruined hand. The man fell from his saddle, howling. "Next one goes center," Wesley warned, though his vision swam slightly. "I've got enough bullets for all." Sadie's father kicked his horse forward, face twisted with fury. "You're dead, Porter! Dead as—" Another scream from the cabin cut him off. Rawer this time. Primal. Sadie's voice rose in unmistakable agony. Wesley risked a glance back through the open door. Sadie had collapsed to her knees, both hands clutching her belly, face contorted in pain. This wasn't like the night's false labor. The baby was coming, ready or not. "Sadie!" Her father's voice cracked. For the first time, something other than anger showed on his face as he watched his daughter writhe in pain. "She needs help," Wesley said, keeping his rifle trained on the group, though his wounded arm trembled. Blood dripped steadily from his fingers. "Your grandchild is coming into this world. You wanted to save your name. Now save her life." The father sat frozen in his saddle, rope forgotten in his hand. Another of Sadie's cries echoed off the ridge. Wesley saw the man's face change, hatred warring with something deeper, something that remembered holding a newborn daughter, perhaps. "Pa!" Sadie's voice was thick with tears and pain. "Pa, please!" The sound seemed to break something in the older man. The rope slipped from his fingers to the ground. His shoulders sagged as if a great weight had settled on them. "Lower your guns," he ordered roughly. When his men hesitated, he barked, "Do it! That's my child in there!" Weapons lowered slowly all around. Wesley kept his rifle up a moment longer, reading the faces before him, then gradually lowered it as well. "She needs a doctor," he said quietly. The father nodded, suddenly looking older than his years. "Town's 2 hours' ride. Bill." He turned to one of his men. "Ride hard for Doc Matthews. Tell him it's urgent." The rider wheeled his horse and galloped down the trail. Inside the cabin, Sadie cried out again. Wesley's vision blurred at the edges, blood loss making itself known. But he kept his voice steady. "You can come in," he told her father, "but leave the violence outside. This is a birth, not a war." The older man dismounted slowly, like a man in a dream. He walked toward the cabin, past Wesley, all the righteous anger drained from him. At the door, he paused, looking at his daughter huddled on the floor. "Sadie," he whispered. "Oh, my girl." Wesley watched them for a moment, saw the father kneel beside his child, saw Sadie's hand grasp his despite everything. Then the wound in his shoulder sent a spike of pain through him, and the world tilted sideways. He caught himself against the doorframe, rifle clattering to the porch boards. The last thing he saw was Sadie's concerned face turned toward him, her lips forming his name, before darkness claimed him. His last conscious thought was a prayer, not for himself, but for the new life struggling to enter the world, and for the healing of hearts too long hardened by pride. The mountain air carried the sound of weeping. Not bitter tears now, but the kind that come when walls finally crack and mercy finds its way through. Wesley's world spun as he slumped against the doorframe. The rough-hewn wood scraped his back as he slid down, leaving a dark streak of blood behind him. The cabin tilted and swayed before his eyes like a ship at sea. Through the haze, he heard Sadie cry out again, a sound of pure anguish that cut straight to his heart. "Get him inside." Sadie's voice was strained with pain. "Please, Pa, help him." Rough hands gripped Wesley's shoulders, making him grunt as fire lanced through his wound. The father, who'd been ready to kill him moments ago, now dragged him carefully across the threshold. Wesley's boots scraped across the plank floor as the older man propped him against the wall near the stove. "Bleeding bad?" the father muttered, his voice gruff but lacking its earlier hatred. He pressed a clean rag against Wesley's shoulder, making spots dance before Wesley's eyes. Another contraction seized Sadie. She gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. "Pa," she gasped. "The baby, it's coming now." The father's weather-beaten face went pale. He looked between his daughter and Wesley, clearly torn. Outside, the icy mountain rain began to fall, drumming against the cabin roof. Tend to her," Wesley managed, though his tongue felt thick. "I'll keep." The father nodded once, sharply, then moved to Sadie's side. His hands shook as he helped her to the bed. Wesley could see the man's internal struggle written across his features, pride warring with love, anger with fear. "What do I do?" the father's voice cracked. "I don't know how to—" "There are clean linens," Sadie said between panting breaths, "in the chest, and water needs boiling." Wesley drifted in and out of consciousness as father and daughter worked together. He heard Sadie giving instructions, her voice growing weaker but never losing its determination. The father moved about the cabin, gathering supplies, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "Our Father," Wesley whispered, his head lolling against the wall. "Who art in heaven." The prayer felt rusty on his tongue after so many years, but it came back like an old friend. Rain pelted the windows as Sadie's labor progressed. Wesley forced his eyes open when her cries grew stronger, more urgent. The father knelt at the bedside, his face a mask of concern and regret. "I see the head," the older man said, voice trembling. "Lord help me, I see my grandchild coming." Sadie screamed then, a sound of terrible effort and determination. Wesley's prayer grew louder, though his voice was barely a whisper. "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." Through the open door came the sound of horses moving out. The hired guns, Wesley realized dimly, were leaving. Perhaps they'd seen enough violence for one day. Perhaps they'd recognized something holy happening in this humble cabin. "Push, girl," the father urged, his voice thick with tears. "Push now." Sadie's cry reached a crescendo, then broke off suddenly. In the ringing silence that followed, a new sound filled the cabin, thin and wavering at first, then growing stronger. A baby's first angry wail at the world. "A boy," the father choked out. "A perfect boy." Wesley's vision cleared enough to see the father cradling a small, squirming bundle. The man's hands, so recently curled around a weapon, now tenderly cleaned and wrapped his grandson. Tears streamed openly down his cheeks. "Sadie," he whispered, laying the infant in her arms. "Oh, my girl, can you ever forgive me?" Sadie's pale face glowed as she held her son. "Pa," she murmured, "look at him. Look what your pride almost destroyed." The father fell to his knees beside the bed. His shoulders shook with sobs. "I was wrong," he said. "So wrong. I let fear and shame blind me. I forgot." His voice broke. "I forgot that love matters more than anything." Wesley's head swam, but he smiled faintly. The scene before him blurred. Father and daughter reconciling, a new life wailing its presence to the world. Worth every drop of blood, he thought hazily. The rain continued to fall outside, washing away the last traces of winter. Dawn's first light began to creep through the windows, painting everything in soft gold. Wesley saw the father stand and remove his heavy coat. With gentle hands, he tucked it around Sadie and the baby. "I'm sorry," the father whispered, stroking Sadie's hair as he hadn't done since she was small. "I'm so sorry, child." Wesley's prayer faded to silence as darkness crept in around the edges of his vision. But his heart was at peace. He'd kept his promise. Sadie was safe, her child was born, and love had won out over hatred. The last thing he heard before consciousness slipped away was the baby's strong cry, mingling with the sound of healing rain on the mountain. Wesley drifted through shadows and half-dreams. Fever wrapped him in wool, thick and suffocating. Sometimes he heard voices, Sadie's gentle murmur, a baby's cry, the deep rumble of a man's repentant prayer. Time slipped past like water through his fingers. When awareness finally returned, it came with the soft glow of morning light through the cabin's eastern window. Wesley blinked, his vision clearing slowly. He lay in his own bed, shoulder wrapped in clean bandages that smelled of witch hazel and yarrow. His shirt had been changed, and someone had propped him up with extra pillows. The cabin was quiet, except for a gentle humming. Wesley turned his head carefully, mindful of the dull ache in his shoulder. There sat Sadie in the rocking chair he'd carved last winter, cradling her newborn son. Sunlight caught in her hair as she nursed the baby, her face serene despite the shadows of exhaustion beneath her eyes. The sight made his throat tight with memory. Another woman, another child, long ago. A creak of floorboards drew his attention to Sadie's father, who sat at the table nearby. The man's face was lined with weariness, his eyes red-rimmed from what Wesley guessed were tears, rather than lack of sleep. Gone was the righteous fury that had driven him up the mountain with rope and rifle. In its place sat a man hollowed out by shame. "You're awake." Sadie's soft voice broke the silence. She smiled at Wesley, relief evident in her eyes. "We were worried. The fever only broke yesterday." Wesley tried to speak, found his throat too dry. The father quickly poured water from the pitcher and brought it to him. Wesley accepted the cup with his good hand, noting how the older man's fingers trembled slightly. 2 days? Wesley asked after drinking. Sadie nodded. "The bullet went clean through, thank the Lord. Pa knew enough field medicine to stop the bleeding and clean it proper." Wesley glanced at her father, who wouldn't meet his eyes. The man's shoulders were bowed, as if carrying an invisible weight. "I owe you more than I can repay," the father said finally, his voice rough. "You protected my girl when I was the one she needed protection from." He ran a hand over his face. "Fear's an ugly thing. Fear of what folks would say, what they'd think. I let town gossip matter more than my own flesh and blood." The man's words hung heavy in the morning air. Outside, a mountain jay called, sharp and clear. The baby made a small sound, and Sadie adjusted her shawl, humming softly to settle him. Wesley studied the father's face, saw the torment there, the desperate need for absolution. He thought carefully before speaking. "Forgiveness ain't like gold or cattle," Wesley said at last. "Can't be earned or bought. It's given free, like grace." He paused, remembering his own long years of grief and guilt. "Your task ain't to earn it. It's to live by it. Show your daughter every day that love wins out over pride." Tears welled in the father's eyes. He bowed his head, hands clasped tight. "Then I'll start now," he whispered, "if the Lord and my girl will let me." Sadie reached out and touched her father's arm. "Pa," she said softly. The single word carried years of hurt, but also hope. The baby finished nursing, and Sadie rose carefully to bring him to Wesley's bedside. "Would you like to hold him?" she asked. "You haven't properly met yet." Wesley nodded, throat tight as she laid the tiny bundle in his good arm. The infant was small but sturdy, with a shock of dark hair and his mother's delicate features. His tiny fist wrapped around Wesley's weathered finger with surprising strength. "He needs a name," Sadie said. "Pa suggested his father's name, Elias, but—" She hesitated. "I'd like you to name him, if you're willing. You gave us both life that night." Wesley stared down at the baby, remembering the storm, the desperate hours, the mercy that had flowed like spring water through the cracks of broken hearts. He thought of how close they'd all come to losing everything: life, family, faith itself. But God had given them another chance, had he not? Had opened eyes blinded by pride and hearts frozen by grief. "Chance," Wesley said softly, running a gentle finger over the baby's cheek. "The Lord gave us all one more chance that night. Seems fitting to remember it." "Chance," Sadie repeated, tasting the name. A smile bloomed on her face. "Yes, Chance Porter McCready." Wesley looked up sharply at the double surname, but Sadie's eyes were firm. "You're as much his family now as anyone," she said. "If you'll have us." The father cleared his throat. "It's a good name," he said. "Strong, but humble, like its meaning." He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the mountain slopes where snow still lingered in the shadows. "I reckon we all got a chance now. To do better. To be better." Baby Chance squirmed in Wesley's arm, letting out a small cry. Sadie lifted him gently, cradling him close as she paced the floor. Her father watched her, love and regret warring on his face. "I'll need to ride down to town soon," he said. "Tell your ma you're safe. Bring up some proper supplies." He hesitated. "If you want, I could bring her to visit. She's been sick with worry, though she was too afraid of me to say so." Sadie's eyes filled with tears. "I'd like that, Pa." Wesley watched them, father and daughter taking their first tentative steps toward healing. The morning light streamed stronger now through the windows, warming the cabin's wooden walls. Outside, spring was coming to the mountain, melting away the last traces of winter's bitterness. Chance's small sounds filled the quiet room, tiny sighs and grunts that spoke of new life, of future possibilities. Wesley closed his eyes, feeling peace settle over him like a familiar blanket. His shoulder still ached, but it was a clean pain, honest as the mountain itself. A reminder that some things were worth bleeding for. A family had been born here, he realized. Not just a baby, but a gathering of souls bound together by forgiveness and grace. Different from what any of them had planned or expected, but no less real for that. The mountain jay called again, its voice carrying with the clarity of crystal. Wesley opened his eyes to see Sadie smiling down at her son, her father's hand resting gently on her shoulder. The scene burned itself into his heart, a picture of redemption as pure as fresh snow, as precious as spring rain. Chance Porter McCready slept peacefully in his mother's arms, unaware that his very name would forever remind them all of the night when love proved stronger than pride, and mercy triumphed over judgment. The mountain air carried the sweet scent of melting snow and new grass as Wesley stood at the cabin door, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky. 6 weeks had passed since the night of Chance's birth, and spring was returning to the high country in earnest. The creek below ran full and strong with snowmelt, its voice a constant song through day and night. From inside came the soft sounds of Sadie preparing breakfast, humming an old hymn as baby Chance cooed in his cradle. The familiar domestic rhythm brought a warmth to Wesley's chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. He shifted his healing shoulder, testing its strength. The wound had closed clean, leaving only a slight stiffness to remind him of that desperate night. "Riders coming," he called quietly through the door. In the distance, he could make out a small procession winding up the trail. The town preacher in his black coat, followed by Sadie's parents, and, to his surprise, a wagon full of townspeople. Sadie appeared beside him, Chance bundled warmly in her arms. "Is that Reverend Matthews?" she asked, squinting down the trail. Her father's letter requesting the preacher's visit had gone out 2 weeks ago, but the spring mud had made travel slow. "Appears so," Wesley nodded. He noticed how she stood straighter now, no longer carrying the weight of shame on her shoulders. The past weeks had brought healing to more than just his bullet wound. The morning sun caught the water droplets hanging from pine branches, making them shine like crystal. Wesley thought it fitting weather for a baptism, all things washed clean and sparkling with new possibility. The preacher reached them first, dismounting with dignity despite his mud-splattered boots. He was a tall man with kind eyes and gray at his temples. "Brother McCready," he said, extending his hand, "Brother Porter wrote to me of what happened here, of how you showed Christ's love when others showed only judgment." Wesley ducked his head, uncomfortable with praise. "Did what needed doing is all." "Sometimes that's exactly what the Lord asks of us," the preacher smiled. He turned to Sadie, his expression gentle. "And this must be young Master Chance. Are you ready to dedicate him to God's care?" Sadie's parents arrived then, her mother rushing forward to embrace her daughter carefully around the baby. The two women had begun mending their relationship during visits over the past weeks, though there were still tender places that needed time to heal. More wagons were arriving now, carrying familiar faces from town. The mercantile owner and his wife, the blacksmith's family, others who had stood silent that day in the street. They came bearing gifts, fresh-baked bread wrapped in clean cloth, colorful quilts, jars of preserves, even a rocking horse someone had carved. Wesley watched them approach with wary amazement. These same people who had turned away from Sadie's pain now came offering reconciliation. He recognized the courage it took to face one's own failures. They gathered by the creek, where the bank sloped gently to the water. The morning had grown warm, enough to make the shade of the pines welcome. Reverend Matthews rolled up his sleeves and stepped into the shallow water, his voice carrying clear over its rushing sound. "We come together today to witness this child's baptism," he began, "but we also come seeking healing for our community. The scripture tells us, 'Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new.'" Sadie stood between her parents, Wesley close behind them. She had dressed Chance in a white gown her mother had saved from her own childhood. The baby watched the moving water with wide eyes, quiet in his mother's arms. "Will you bring the child?" the preacher asked. Sadie stepped forward. Wesley saw her father reach out to steady her as she navigated the slippery bank. The gesture spoke volumes about the change in him. The creek water sparkled as Reverend Matthews cupped it in his hand, letting it fall over Chance's dark hair. "I baptize you, Chance Porter McCready, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." The baby startled at the cool water but didn't cry. Instead, he reached up toward the sunlight filtering through the pine boughs, making the gathered crowd smile. Wesley stood apart from the group, watching Sadie's face shine with joy and peace. She had found her place again, not just with her family, but in the wider embrace of a community that had learned the hard way about mercy. The townspeople came forward one by one to greet the new family, offering not just gifts, but words of apology and blessing. Wesley noticed how they included him in their greetings, acknowledging his role in this story of redemption. Dawn painted the eastern sky in delicate strokes of pink and gold, touching the high peaks of the San Juan Mountains first before spilling down into Pine Hollow. The early morning light caught the heavy dewdrops clinging to pine needles, making them sparkle like tiny stars fallen to earth. Wesley McCready stood at the base of his cabin, studying the roof with practiced eyes. Winter's heavy snows had loosened several wooden shakes, and the spring rains had revealed spots where water found its way inside. He'd been putting off the repairs until the weather settled, but now summer had arrived in earnest, bringing with it perfect days for working in the high-altitude air. The sound of Sadie's soft humming drifted from her vegetable garden, where neat rows of green shoots pushed through the dark mountain soil. She had carved the plot from a sunny patch near the cabin, working the earth with quiet determination, until even Wesley had to admit it looked promising. Now peas climbed their poles while potato plants spread their leaves, and tiny carrot tops waved in the morning breeze. Baby Chance lay nearby in a cushioned wooden box, sheltered from the sun by a stretched piece of canvas. His dark eyes followed his mother's movements as she worked, and occasionally his delighted giggles would join her gentle singing. Wesley gathered his tools and climbed the sturdy ladder he'd positioned against the cabin wall. The old roof timbers creaked familiarly under his weight as he settled into the work. From this height, he could see clear down the valley where the creek caught morning light like scattered silver coins. "Mind you don't fall," Sadie called up to him, pausing in her gardening to shade her eyes against the sun. "That shoulder of yours isn't fully healed yet." "Been climbing these mountains since before you were born, girl," Wesley replied, but his gruff tone held warmth. Truth was, he appreciated her concern. It had been a long time since anyone had worried about his well-being. The morning passed in peaceful industry. Wesley replaced damaged shakes and patched worn spots, while below Sadie tended her plants and spoke softly to Chance. The baby had grown strong over the past months, his laugh becoming one of the sweetest sounds Wesley had ever heard echo off these ridges. Around midday, the familiar sound of wagon wheels announced visitors. Sadie's parents had made it their habit to come up the mountain trail once a week, weather permitting. Their wagon always carried supplies from town: flour, sugar, coffee, and other necessities. But Wesley knew they really came for the joy of watching their grandson grow and healing the wounds in their family. "There's my boy," Sadie's mother called out as she hurried from the wagon. She scooped Chance from his box, covering his face with kisses while he squealed in delight. Her husband followed more slowly, carrying a heavy sack of provisions. Wesley climbed down from the roof, wiping sweat from his brow. "Thomas," he nodded to Sadie's father. The two men had found their way to a careful respect over the past months. "Roof needed fixing?" Thomas asked, setting down his burden. "Just patching where winter found weak spots," Wesley replied, Reckon it'll hold now." They shared a moment of understanding. Both men knew the importance of maintaining a solid shelter in these mountains. The conversation might seem simple, but it carried the weight of their shared care for Sadie and Chance. The afternoon passed in pleasant company. The women spread a picnic on a blanket in the shade, while Thomas helped Wesley finish the roof repairs. The sound of happy chatter and occasional laughter drifted up to the men as they worked. As evening approached, Sadie's parents bid their farewells with promises to return the following week. Wesley watched their wagon disappear down the trail, marveling at how his quiet mountain had become a place of family gatherings and weekly visits. The sunset painted the western sky in deep oranges and purples as Wesley settled into his favorite spot by the cabin door. Chance lay contentedly in his arms, the baby's weight warm and solid against his chest. Inside, Sadie lit the lamp and opened her Bible, its pages worn smooth with daily reading. Fireflies began to emerge from the gathering shadows, their gentle lights dancing between the trees like earthbound stars. The evening air carried the sweet scent of wild roses and sun-warmed pine. "The Lord is my shepherd," Sadie read, her voice clear and peaceful in the growing darkness. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Wesley closed his eyes, letting the familiar words wash over him. Chance made soft, cooing sounds, his tiny hand wrapped firmly around Wesley's weathered finger. After a while, Sadie closed the Bible and joined them at the door. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. "I should stay through autumn, help with the harvest. That garden will need tending, and there's preserving to be done for winter." Wesley felt something tighten in his chest. Hope and fear tangled together. He looked out over his mountain, where he'd once come to escape the sound of babies crying. Now that same sound brought healing instead of pain. "This mountain's seen death and birth both," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "Maybe it's time for living." As if in agreement, Chance let out a peal of laughter that echoed off the ridge faces, bright and clear as a bell. The sound rolled through the valley and came back to them, multiplied by the mountains until it seemed the whole world was joining in his joy. Wesley watched the fireflies dance and felt Sadie's gentle presence beside him. Here, where he'd once come to hide from life, he'd somehow found it again, through courage, through mercy, through the innocent trust of a child. The frontier had taught him harsh lessons about loss, but now it was teaching him about renewal. The baby laughed again, and this time Wesley laughed with him, the sound carrying far into the summer night. Above them, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, witnesses to the simple truth that love and faith could still work miracles in these wild places. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.